We have a planet in the solar system that is entirely populated by robots,
Oh yeah,
and that is Mars.
right. Yeah. Wow. Maybe they'll rise up when we get there. Then
I mean, there's only two working at the moment, so unlikely. Hello, welcome to Matter Over Mind. My name is Stephen.
And I'm Thomas, and today we're going to be covering the psychology of Mars. So, it's potential in the next several decades that we may muster up the relevant resources to actually begin a manned mission to Mars. I mean, we've sent plenty of stuff there already, but the next step is taking humans there. Obviously, there's a bunch of... Sorry, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, did you know that, or, I mean, you know it, but it's just a kind of quirky thing about history that currently we have a planet in the solar system that is entirely populated by robots.
Oh, yeah.
And that is
You're
Mars.
Right. Yeah. Wow. Maybe they'll rise up when we get there. Then
I mean, there's only two working at the moment, so unlikely.
But yeah, so obviously there's a bunch of physics to kind of work out before we even start thinking about trips to Mars, but that's perhaps another episode. But yeah, so today, I guess the psychology of these sort of extra long, potentially up to year-long missions to Mars. I mean, it's kind of a trope in sci-fi movies, right, where you have a cooped-up crew of sort of 5 or so people that end up all going crazy and some disaster happens. So I guess, what psychologically and I guess emotionally, what could, say, 3+ year sort of mission in an isolated box do to somebody?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I always think about Event Horizon as the classic sci-fi. I mean, it's true that they did go through a black hole, or the ship went through a black hole and found pure evil. So I think that's unlikely going to Mars. But it kind of, as you say, I don't think it's a kind of realistic question. So yeah, how can we... What do we know about this question, I suppose, is the thing. So we're a bit limited, really, in our data on what we can say scientifically about this. I think we can say quite a lot instinctively and just sort of using what we might call common sense. There's likely to be issues with people living in close proximity. It's dangerous. You can't go out for a walk. All the obvious stuff, I suppose. It doesn't take a psychologist to hypothesize about those sorts of things. If we're looking for data, then there's a few places that we would go for this. So doing my research for this podcast, it was quite interesting, actually. I learned a new word that I hadn't really come across before, which is overwintering. Okay. So overwintering is what they call trips to the Antarctic, where there is an Antarctic survey that is manned by... It's a multinational group of people. I think the British set it up, but it's multinational. Lots of cooperation across nations. It's kind of a model of how to do science in many respects. And there's somebody there all the time. It's pretty much manned all the time, but there's times when you can't really get people in and out very easily. Mm-hmm. So basically, if you go for the winter, you're stuck there, and there's a handful of people, and you can't really go out. It's so cold. It's we just going out would be a risk. Very hostile temperatures, and it's dark all the time over the winter, so you don't even get any sort of seasonal variation. It's white. I suppose at night it wouldn't even look that. It's just you just don't get anything really looking out to see what's happening. So it's a very hostile place, and you're there for a long time. So you're there for months at a time. So that's one of the best areas that we can use what's called an analog. So there's various analogues that we have that we can then learn about what it's like to be in those sorts of places. So there's the Antarctic overwintering. Mm-hmm. There's the ISS, the International Space Station, which obviously there has been a few people that have spent longer than they expected there. That's quite an interesting one.
Yeah. That was fairly recent,
So
wasn't it? A few people got
fairly recent,
stranded
yeah.
there.
They ended up there for months, and obviously there's stuff we can learn about that. I don't think there's been much research done on those particular people, but we have learned a bit. But the interesting thing about the ISS, actually, it's probably the least useful in many respects. Although you have got the weightlessness sensation, so that's something that is specific to space travel, obviously. But other than that, you're very close to home. You know, if there was an emergency, so long as Elon's rockets don't keep blowing up, you can be rescued. You know, so there are ways of getting out of there. Although, as you said, the recent events suggest that it's not as easy as that. But you're a lot closer. Plus, the time lag between in communications not just normal. You can talk normally. So yeah, obviously that is an area of interest. And the other one is these analog experiments that have been done specifically for missions like Mars and Moon. That we're going back to the Moon, and we're going to spend much more time there. Is the plan? So there's a couple there that I've read up about. There's the Mars 500, which was actually based in Russia. This was when relations between Russia and the West were a lot friendlier. This was again a multinational group. So we had a couple of Russian people. It was in Moscow, I think it was, or was it Star City? I think it was done. And there was a Chinese person, there was a French or an Italian person. So it was a bit of a mix of different cultures. And that was there for over 500 days. So these people are going into a simulation that they're basically going into a set of buildings that are about a similar size to what the actual Mars spacecraft would be, so pretty small. I think on the Mars 500 there were 6 people. On the American one that's called Chapia, there were 4, 2 men and 2 women.
Okay.
And so these are meant to be analogs. So they're staying in these places. If they go out, they have to go out for a mission, and they'll have to get togged into their space gear as if they were doing a spacewalk. And they simulate an actual mission. So for a certain amount of time, they're traveling to Mars, and then they've got missions to do. They do certain things. They've got exercises and experiments to run as if they were actually on Mars, and then basically it's the trip back. So again, they go back into their habitat then, and they have to live as if they were on their journey back home. So those are really interesting. Obviously, they're lacking the hazard factor, the danger, and they're lacking the lack of gravity and everything, but they are experiencing everything else, I would say. So that's basically what we know about these things, I would say.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I was going to ask about when they're in these pods, how much of it is traveling versus, I guess, on Mars. But I suppose I had a look just now actually, and there's not really a difference in hours per day. Because I was going to ask if that would have an effect, but I think a 30-minute difference between 24 hours is not really
on Mars. Yeah, on Mars. But don't forget, it takes sort of 6 months to get there at least. So a lot of their mission will be just traveling in space.
Yeah.
So, there you've got obviously no night and day really as you get as you're traveling in space. I don't quite know whether they turn the spaceship to the sun during their waking hours and away from it. I don't think they do that. So basically, everything's the same all the time. So that's one of the problems. But one of the reasons why the Antarctica missions are so useful, because that obviously very similar, really. But once they get to Mars, the day length is pretty similar. So they're probably not going to notice much difference with that. But as I say, a lot of their mission will be in between.
Okay. So in terms of, I guess, what were the results of these analog, I guess, simulations essentially? Were they successful? I guess what were they testing for? What's the
Well, the good news is they didn't kill each other, so
Oh,
that's good. So I think there's a few bits of scientific research that is actually quite interesting and that not necessarily common sense. So you as I say, I think a lot of the stuff that we talk about, you'd say, well, yeah, not a surprise about that. But then there's other things that are a bit more interesting. So, for instance, the Antarctic survey one, something was quite interesting there. They found that people that spent a long time overwintering had a reduction in the size of the hippocampus, in particular what's called the dendate gyrus. So the hippocampus is actually itself quite a small part in the brain, but it's associated with a lot of really important stuff, including things like fear and anxiety, but also other emotions. Memory is big; it plays a big part in memory, and this particular little part of the hippocampus, the dendate gyrus, apparently is responsible for things like, pattern separation, it's described as, which is, I think, really interesting. So this is our ability to distinguish similar experiences. So you can imagine, if you go to, suppose like you're going to work every day, you take the same train every day, it would be easy for your brain to kind of get confused about, what happened today on the way to work, because it all seems very similar. So you get off the train at the same place, you go to the same place, you do the same things roughly. But I mean, as time goes on, it starts to get more difficult to distinguish. But when you came home and you spoke to Celine, she said, "What, how was your day today?" If you were to say, "Oh yeah, it was great," well, apart from the train being late, you'd be able to distinguish today's experience from yesterday's experience because of this this area of activation in the brain. So if you imagine that is affected by this overwintering. So what they found is that around 7% change in the size of this region, this dentate gyrus. So 7% is quite a big change, and plus or minus 3. So I suppose it depends how you take that. It could be that it's much less of an effect, but now if you're talking about 10% reduction in the size of this, which affects your ability to distinguish one day from another, one moment from another, given what we've already said about the fact that all the days will be the same because you've got, you don't have any seasons and you don't even have a sort of rhythm of light and dark. I think that could be a real problem. So then, of course, you run into the question of cause and effect. So what these things are, what we're seeing here is a correlation. So these would have been people that would, after their mission in the Antarctica, would have undergone a scan. And so they've been able to see the size of this region. Now, the question is, are we getting this effect because there is something that's happening that's making our brain do that? Or is our brain doing that because there is a change in our experience, and therefore it doesn't need to be distinguishing because there's nothing to distinguish? Does that make sense? So it could be that it's affecting it. So it could be that it's affecting the person's ability to distinguish things because everything's the same, or it could be just that, like a muscle that you don't use very much, it just doesn't need to have that size and structure because there's nothing to distinguish. So I think that's quite an interesting question. I don't think we know the answer. We can't know the answer to that yet. That's always one of the challenges with neuroscience and taking scans. This is where I think there are lots of problems with this type of research. You never quite know. Is this causing it, or is it just because of what's happening?
Yeah. I suppose any experiment to directly test that might be a bit inhumane, right?
That's right. Yeah,
you start removing
you
stimulus
bump into all sorts of ridiculous ethical challenges.
PC gone mad.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, but I think that's really interesting. So it actually reduces the size of this area. So that's one piece of research, and that was related to overwintering.
Okay.
The other one that I think is quite interesting was this actually was part of the Mars 500 experiment, which I've mentioned. And this was using something called the IAPS, IAPS, stands for the International Affective Picture System. So this is a way of, this is a standard test that's been around for quite some time.
Yep.
So it's always good if on these sorts of experiments you can use a standard test because you've got a lot of data.
Yeah.
And so obviously you can compare it to something that you can kind of predict because you've got a lot of data. And what happens with this thing is you get 3 different types of colour photographs. There's over 1,000 different photographs as part of this IAPS. And you present these photographs to people, and they have a little questionnaire that they have to fill in. Excuse me. They have to fill in a little questionnaire that basically says what they thought about this picture. And they have a pleasant set of pictures. So pictures that have already been kind of standardized to be what we might call pleasant, nice pictures to look at. So these are things of like puppies, babies, and romantic couples. So we'd say, oh, that's nice. That's a nice picture. We'd say that's a pleasant picture. And then unpleasant pictures would be violence, injuries to people, things like snakes and spiders and things that other people might be frightened of and find unpleasant. So I don't know how brutal these pictures are. I've not seen them. I suspect they're not released because obviously you don't want everybody to have knowledge of these pictures. It will mess your experiments up. So they're not something that generally is available. So I've not seen them myself. But anyway, that's what they are. And then you've got neutral pictures, photographs of neutral things like, I don't know, household objects, cup saucers, things like that. Unless you've got a fetish that you're worried about some sort of weird phobia about cups or something, which would screw up the experiment, then generally people have a neutral response to that. So basically you're looking at these pictures and you're saying, I think I'll give that a 3 on the pleasant unpleasant scale, or and there's I've forgotten the exact the 3 different modes, but you've got sort of valence, which is how much that affects you. So that's like an emotional response. There's a dominant response, so how you feel it affects you in terms of whether you feel undermined by it or not in some way. And there's a third one which I can't remember now. But so basically it's about your emotional response to things. What was interesting was as you get to the end of the mission, or actually the second or the third quarter, you start to notice that people's response to the horrible pictures, the unpleasant pictures, their emotional response sort of deadens a bit. So they score them less as less unpleasant, I suppose, is the easiest way to put it, which is quite interesting. So this suggests that as they get further on in the experiment, that they're being affected less and less by these unpleasant pictures. So I suppose I'll ask you, what would your kind of layman's thoughts about that? What do you think that could mean? I mean, we are having to interpret this and think, what does this actually mean? What do you reckon?
I guess before I give my answer, how did their responses to the pleasant pictures change, or not?
Statistically, that's not significant according to the research. So the one area was these unpleasant pictures.
Interesting.
And it also had some sort of effect on their so they also tested for hormonal changes as well. And so that there was also some registering of changes in that. I think it was serotonin levels increased a little bit. So again, that was an extra thing that they were testing for.
That's interesting. Yeah, because I would have thought, before knowing that there wasn't really any statistical difference with the pleasant pictures, I would have assumed it all kind of just tend toward the neutral. and then just general apathy kind of takes over. But it doesn't seem like that's what's happening.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So they're just so essentially more desensitized to negative stimulus, I guess. Interesting. Could it be? There's some. I don't remember what the test is called, even if it has a name. But I was watching this thing, and there's some statistician who makes videos and stuff on YouTube, and she gave an example of this test that they did to see how people respond to boredom, essentially. So they put them in an empty room with nothing for 15 minutes, and then they, I guess, ask them about it. But then there's an adaptation to that experiment where they put in a button where if you press the button you get shocked, and I think it was something like about a quarter of women press the button and get shocked rather than do absolutely nothing for 15 minutes, and I think it's 2/3 of men, so 6% or whatever of guys press that button. So maybe whatever it is with the desensitizing to these negative images, maybe it's the same mechanism that would make, I guess, statistically a non-negligible percentage of people want to press the button rather than do nothing. I guess that would be my...
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. And it is that's a very interesting piece of experiment. Well, it's a very interesting experiment. It's remarkable, isn't it? As human beings, we cannot stand boredom. We are so averse to not having anything to do that we would rather give ourselves an electric shock, which I think that's absolutely hilarious. Maybe it's the same mechanism. I think that the research suggests in the paper. So I'll put links to these papers in the show notes and also in the Facebook page. So you can have a look for yourselves, listeners, to read these papers. There's two papers I'm drawing from basically. One called Space Analogues and Behavioural Health, Performance Research Review and Recommendations Checklist from ESA Topical Team. These are just so snappy, the names of these papers.
Rolls right off the tongue, that one. Yeah.
That's the first one. It really trips off the tongue. And the next one is the During the Long Way to Mars, Effective 520 Days of Confinement on the Assessment of Affective Stimuli and Stage Alteration in Mood and Plasma Hormone Levels. So they're the two papers. So I'll put links on anyway. I think they're both open source, so you can look at them. I mean, basically, it's a sort of defense mechanism is the way that I kind of understood the conclusions that they're coming to, is that it's a way of trying to so as human beings, so one of the ways of thinking about human beings is as a complex system, and we are trying to, the brain is trying to find homeostasis constantly, essentially. So that is a balance. So you're always trying to balance one thing with another. So if you get an external something external happens that disturbs your balance, then what will tend to happen is your system, the system inside, which is your brain, will try to compensate for that in some way to maintain this homeostasis. So this kind of constant equilibrium that your body, same goes for your body, your physical body, and also your brain, and lots of other systems as well. This is a whole cybernetics is a whole discipline in itself, but I think that's quite an interesting way of thinking about our psychology. And so perhaps thinking about it like that is a good way of thinking about it. So if you're feeling anxious, stressed, really fed up, then your reactions to negative stimuli, your brain is likely to reduce the way that you respond to that to maintain this kind of homeostasis. That's the way I would sort of describe it. And this seems to be linked to this thing known as the third quarter phenomenon. So I think we were chatting about this in the garden. You and Celine came over at the weekend, and we were just chatting about this a little bit. Do you remember us talking about the 3/4 phenomenon?
Yes, I was complaining about my research being a bit of a trudge at the moment, and it turns out, I'm in the third quarter of my funding, I guess. So
Yeah.
just over halfway, and things are getting a bit rough because I don't know, demotivated because everything's being a pain.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's one of the main things that this research found, and they call it a sort of staged process. So in the first 2 or 3 months, people are quite enthusiastic and excited. So even though they're not going anywhere, actually, these people, 4, 6 people, I think it was, stuck in this very small place with all these days ahead of them, 300 so days ahead of them. They're still feeling pretty good. Still quite excited. Morale is high. And then once you get to the halfway point, then you start to notice people struggling a bit. So in the Mars 500 experiment, they spend the time as if they were going to Mars, and then when they get to Mars, then some of the crew have to go out and do some experiments and stuff. And so there's lots of work going on there, lots of novel stuff. Mm-hmm. So that again, they're okay then. But then once that stops and they're now over halfway, then people start getting quite low and anxious and depressed. And that's part of it, is that you've still got almost half of the time to go. So you're looking back and you're saying, look, I've just spent 250 days in this place doing this stuff. All the exciting stuff's now done. And I've got to spend another 200 plus days, 250 days in this place with these people.
Doing the same stuff, yeah.
Doing the same stuff, yeah. And that's when it really struggles. And that's when they start to see these effects with the hippocampus and also the things around the seeming deadening of reactions to negative stimuli. So it seems to me like a sort of protective mechanism, just sort of deadening your emotions, which, again, is something that we do see in other psychological states. That we know that people talk about being numb if they've had overstimulation. So I think there's it's probably that, but we need to learn much more about it. And there's obviously as well, there's like an accumulative effect of lots of the other things that we've already talked about. So things like sleep deprivation. We're not good at sort of sorting out our sleep patterns when we don't have day and night. So that's just very difficult when you don't have that day and night. The same sorts of things are talked about in some countries, like Iceland and other countries that are quite close to the North Pole. They also talk about similar problems where long periods of darkness. And in fact, even in the UK where we're based, in the winter, we talk about SAD, seasonally adjusted disorder, don't we? And I do think that's a kind of real thing. So yeah, there's lots of stuff going on, and it's building up and building up. And then you've mentioned, even in our own experience, you're doing your PhD. You're sort of about halfway now, and you're thinking about all the stuff that you've already done. Essentially, you've got to do all that again. Plus, the more risky time is coming.
Yeah. The stakes.
I don't want to worry
higher now. Yeah. Well, I mean, I've been given a block of money to do a bit of research with an expected output. So I've done all the training and all the onboarding, upskilling, and all the fun, exciting, novel stuff. And now it's okay. I've done all that stuff. I need to now start producing outputs that my funders will be satisfied with. So there's stakes now, whereas before there wasn't really.
Yeah, that's right. And your the amount of time you've got to fit everything in as you'll become more conscious of that reducing. So I suppose there might be some of that going on as well. So we're used to the third quarter effect, and that's part of it. Another thing that Antarctic overwinterers talk about is the big eye. which relates to sleep deprivation. So it's something that they've coined this the big I, which is basically, you just can't sleep, and obviously trying to operate and do things when you're not enough sleep is not very nice, and you get into a pattern where you're really, really tired, but when you go to bed you can't sleep, but you're nodding off during other times. And we know that dreaming particularly is really, really important, and you need a certain amount of sleep to have decent periods of dreaming. I'm actually reading a book at the moment about dreaming, so maybe that's a topic we can cover at another time, but very, very important for our own mental health. In fact, if we didn't dream, we will probably not be able to function, which is very interesting.
Okay, so we've done some analogs, analog tests, or some simulations of these large time studies, essentially. And I've kind of mentioned this already, or at least the other day. But we've had the last couple of years a reasonably large amount of time in essential isolation, with exception from a handful of people. Now, obviously, this is the COVID lockdowns that happened a few years ago now, and you could bubble up with one or maybe two other households, but you're talking about 6-ish people realistically per bubble, where you couldn't really do a lot. You could go out, you had like an hour walk a day, or I can't remember what the specific rule was, but also prisons. You have people with very long sentences, again, kind of doing routine tasks for X many years at a time. Has there been anything in relation to that, data set that could be transposed or extrapolated to give information on how we may cope with this sort of thing?
It's really interesting. I don't know the answer properly to that question. I know you mentioned it the other day, and I meant to look that up specifically. I think on a very cursory glance, there has been work done on the psychological effect of COVID. The problem, I think, with it is there's a lot of interfering or potentially confounding variables. So when you're doing an experiment, you try and keep it as kind of focused as possible. With COVID, you've got so many different things happening at the same time. I think it's quite difficult to be able to say, this is something that we can take from that experience and apply to space travel. I think what is coming out is that it did have a psychological impact, particularly on young people, and in particular sort of young adults. And that's obviously to do with their social circle. One of the things that younger people really, really need is social interactions. It's part of how you develop as a person and become a rounded human being. And I think there is some concern that during COVID, but also with social media and the fact that we can kind of we can get by now, particularly young people, just basically sitting in front of a screen all day, playing video games or being on social media, and have very little to do with the real world. So I think there is some. You probably wouldn't have to work too hard to make some comparisons. I don't know that there's any work that's been done specifically on that, but yeah, that's interesting. And we do know that think about prisons. Lots of countries, prisons are overcrowded, which means that people have to spend much longer time in their cells. This has a very negative effect on people's mental health and their then behaviour. So we do know that this is one of the problems with prisons as they stand. Prisoners can be in their cells for like 23 hours a day, and that's not good for them. And it gives rise to increased violence and so on. So yeah, I think we do know from some of those studies that these things are possible. I suppose we have to remember that these people have volunteered to go on this mission. So that's a bit different in that they volunteered for it. They've also been selected for. So maybe we should talk a little bit about the way that they're selected and the psychological profiles that might be useful. But these are people that have, in theory, been selected for their ability to cope with those situations. So you would hope that given that they've volunteered for it and they've been selected for it, you'd hope that they would have better chance of coping. But still, still real psychological problems.
Okay. I mean, so you mentioned a few times there about social circles. Obviously, maybe your colleagues when you go into one of these things, but I can imagine, especially with the international missions, it's kind of a mixed bag of who you get put with. So you said about the psychological screening. So I'm assuming most people there are going to be psychologically sound enough to basically get along. But yeah, I guess, has there been in these simulations, has there been any, I guess, fallings out or drama that's happened because people haven't got along or something?
Yeah, there have. I've not been able to read any detailed accounts of these. I'm not sure whether that's because I've just not found them or whether, I suppose, from a ethical perspective, having a detailed account of, how Bob and Nina fell out about keeping their room tidy. Maybe that's the sort of thing you don't necessarily want to share with the public. But yeah, the papers do talk about increased irritability, increased, I suppose, rebelliousness, really, not doing what they were told to do, not wanting to do the experiments, not caring as much, becoming fed up with what they were being told to do by mission control, those sorts of things. Yeah, there are admissions of those things happening. The makeup of these groups is quite interesting. So the two I've looked at in detail is the Chapia, the American one, and the Mars 500, the Russian one. And they're all of the people are professionals. So you've got a bit of a split between, I would say, engineers, medical professionals, doctors, biologists, physicists, that sort of person. So we're talking about people who have spent a lot of time, I suppose, in institutions, and are professional scientists in the main. So that, I suppose, that is a self-selecting group. A lot of them will be quite ambitious people who have managed to, I guess, these are the cream of the cream, really, in general. These are people that have been selected based on a whole set of criteria. And openness is one of the things that they would be looking for. One of the three personality traits that came out was they were selecting for social reciprocity. So, I suppose the generosity of people, they're willing to give and take and give, this kind of recognition that it takes give and take to get through this, so we're going to kind of not demand too much on our rights, that sort of stuff. Patience, an obvious one. Again, just putting up with, I suppose, really crappy days at times and people's behaviour, which would, no matter who you are, you're going to be irritated by other people's behaviour at times, but your ability to cope with that, and low neuroticism. So neuroticism is, again, one of the, so you probably remember I think we've talked about this on this podcast, the 5 standard sort of personality profile tests around psychology tend to get called the big 5: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeable, and neuroticism. So from reading the accounts, they seem to be pretty open as a selection. I think it's unlikely that they're not going to be conscientious. These are scientists who spent a lot of time studying and working hard to get where they are. So that's probably self-selected for that. Extroversion too, so sort of social people. Agreeableness sort of relates to the reciprocity stuff, and low on neuroticism. So I think whilst they didn't give the articles, the papers didn't talk about a specific profile, I think we could assume that with high openness, high conscientiousness, fairly extroverted without being too over the top, Generally agreeable and low in neuroticism. These are the people that you want to spend 500 days in a tin can with, basically.
Yeah.
You wouldn't want somebody that's like terrible mood swings and difficult to. You don't want a mercurial person. Let's put it that way.
That's
in
true.
that situation, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that's going to be selected for. But the other thing to remember is, again, because of our low numbers, because we don't have huge data sets to play with, there's like a half a dozen analogs, and yes, okay, we can use things like the Antarctica missions, but we're limited numbers for a proper study. You'd be hoping for at least 50 people, hundreds of people really, to start getting better data. And so everything I've said so far really has to be caveated by that. If you're talking about 6 people or a dozen people even, that's not enough really to be confident that your results are going to be the same for everybody in every situation. So there's an element of that.
Yeah, no, I mean, that makes sense. Statistics are pretty useful when it comes to making quantitative.
Well, yeah, and you just need the numbers. There comes a point where, as I say, if you're talking about 5 or 6 people, then obviously what you need to do is take that data, and then at some point there'll be a meta study which is able to pool these pieces of research together and get a better picture. So that in psychology, that's kind of what you look for when you're doing research on research, is to say, right, what meta studies have been done, because generally the numbers are fairly small. And you also have, in psychology, we've had, I think this is getting better, but we've had traditionally a problem that a lot of the psychology studies are based upon participant pools who are basically fellow students. So, where do you get your participants from? That's the hardest bit when you're doing experimental stuff. The obvious place to go are your fellow students. And in fact, it was a requirement when I was doing my degree that you had to take part in other people's research. It was a requirement of the course. So you had to volunteer for a number of those things. But of course, that creates a bit of a slightly weird participant pool. As space travel becomes more and more common, so one of our favorite sci-fi series, I think you've watched it, is The Expanse. Do you remember The Expanse?
Yes, I've watched some of it. I've not.
Okay.
Well, we started watching it a while ago. We've not finished it. But,
yeah, it takes a bit getting into the start, but me and Sarah watched it all through, and it's brilliant. But that's kind of in a few hundred years. Imagine space travel is now sort of commonplace, and they're mining all these asteroids and everything, and you're now talking about every man and woman going out into space and experiencing these things. So that'll be a different kettle of fish altogether. It's probably, just before we finish, worth talking about teams as well, because actually the way that teams interact is a really important element for this. So individually, we want people who are fairly open, conscientious, and so on and so on. But when people get together into a team, then obviously there's a specific dynamic there. And that's something that we do know quite a bit about, actually. So we do know how teams operate together. Obviously, the extra factor is the danger and the isolation, all the other stuff. But in everyday experience, we do know about teams. So one of the things that, as an organizational psychologist that I work with, is thinking about how teams get on and how they don't. Now, I did look to see what sort of theoretical model they were using, and I couldn't sort of see a standard one. But the one that we use in the workplace the most is called Belbin, and I'll put a link to that on the show notes, but it's very simple to find. Belbin is a commercial product. I'm not trying to sell for Belbin. I don't have anything to do with them, but I do use their thing from time to time. And Belbin, it's been around a long time. Some of our listeners probably will have heard of it. But basically, what this research goes back to the 70s, I think it was. And Meredith Belbin, a man called Meredith, which I never knew men could be called Meredith. But anyway, a man called Meredith Belbin wanted to understand, what is it about teams when teams work well together or when they clash? And he identified 8 at first and then 9 specific team roles that people tend to fulfill in successful teams. So he did this through a lot of psychometrics and stuff like that, but also saying, these are particular traits, but how do people with these traits sort of work in a team? And so he identified 9 team types. So I'll go through them very, very quickly. We've got a resource investigator, we've got a team worker, we've got a coordinator, what's called a plant, a monitor evaluator, specialist, a shaper, an implementer, and a completer finisher. So we don't have time to go through them all, and it's not sort of relevant to go through them all. But the idea is that if, let's say you had a team of 9 people, then I suppose a perfectly balanced team would be that you'd have one of each.
Yeah.
Now, things are rarely as nice and neat as that, but you need a bit of a balance. So, for instance, a plant is somebody that's, I'm not sure why he called it a plant, but anyway, a plant is the creative person. This is the person that thinks outside of the box, really comes up with wacky ideas, but sometimes they really work. So they're creative, they're imaginative, they solve difficult problems in ways that other people wouldn't really think about. They do have some downsides, as you might expect. Somebody who's a plant might be a bit bored with the day-to-day stuff, not quite as communicative because they're really into their own thing. So the plant, if you had a team full of plants, you can imagine that everybody's fighting with each other to come to do their idea, and nobody's really cooperating. So that's a problem. So to balance that out, you need a team worker, for instance, and that's somebody that helps the team to keep together. They're the sort of glue that keeps the team working. They're very cooperative, they're diplomatic, they're good listeners, they smooth over their peacemakers, those sorts of behaviors. You've also got a shaper who's kind of like I suppose the traditional leader, if you like, but quite assertive, striving, challenging, dynamic, those sorts of things. Likes pressure, likes deadlines, those sorts of things. But they can be a bit over the top and upset people sometimes because their assertiveness can stray into aggressive behaviour and so on. So you get the idea. Now the idea is that these are not types, so it's not like you do a psychometric test and you are a resource investigator. You do some psychometric tests, and then on the basis of that, Belbin will say, well, these are the sorts of roles that you might feel comfortable fulfilling in a team. Okay. So generally people have 2 or 3 that they could do really easily. And so that those will have a lot of overlap in terms of their psychometric profiles. So I suppose, if you think about a resource investigator, might also be very happy being a team worker, might also be very happy being a coordinator. So these are sort of, qualities that would probably go together. So you're able, generally people are able to fulfill more than one role or adapt to where there's a need in that team. So that's quite an interesting way of thinking about teams. And whilst I can't see any evidence that any of these experiments so far has used Belbin, the concept is there. So you're looking at a balance. You don't want the same type of person replicated 6 times. You want some complementary skills and traits and tendencies. So that's quite an interesting insight into the sorts of things that they'll be looking at. That is one of the things, listening to interviews with various, I think Suzanne Bell is a name that is in NASA. She's actually an industrial and organizational psychologist. So she has my training, but has gone further. So she actually is a PhD, really. And so she works for NASA. I need to get my PhD so I could work for that. So she does that, and in her interview she talks about team dynamics. That's one of the things that she's researching, because obviously it's really, really important. You want your team to work well together. On top of that, you've got questions around cultural differences. Do you want a group of people who are all from the same sort of culture? Is that going to work better than a whole set of people from different cultures? I mean, the reality is any space mission like that is likely to be a collaborative effort. So I think you're going to get different cultures. So that can create some issues, but also, again, you might have some complementary sort of viewpoints and so on. So yeah, that's the other thing that's being researched. Don't think we've got a full handle on that yet, but we do know quite a lot about that science already. So I think that will be drawn upon.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that makes sense. Because if you had a bunch of leaders trying to lead the leader, you might be in a bit of a sticky spot.
The other thing that's perhaps worth, I'll just mention it as it's something that sort of appealed to my sort of sensitivities. There's a scene in Interstellar, I know one of your favourite films, where one of I think it's Coop, hands one of the other astronauts. They're way into the mission now, so they've been in space a long time, and he hands one of his fellow astronauts a pair of earphones, and he's listening to the sounds of the earth, so he's listening to thunderstorms, I think it is, rain, and it's a wonderful moment. I think it's a beautiful moment in that film. And I think that's the other factor. So one of the other bits of research that they've looked into is having VR headsets with kind of experiential stuff in there. So, being able to look out into a big field and gives you the impression that you're on the earth, and that you've got the sights and the sounds of the earth. And I think that would be really, really important. So as technology increases and the immersion gets better, I think that's going to be something that will definitely be there. We've not quite got the holodeck yet, but I think that will be the next best thing.
I mean that kind of I suppose very minor spoilers for Silo season 2 if you've not seen it. But there's a scene where one of the characters puts on a VR headset, and obviously if you don't know, the plot of the show is they're all in this massive underground bunker thing, and they have a screen to outside, but it's sort of a nuclear wasteland, or post-apocalyptic sort of nuclear desert. One of the characters later on manages to procure a VR headset, and it's just looking at the forest basically. It's a big moment in the show, so I guess that makes sense. That would probably be quite nice.
That'd be really important. And it could be. I think that's an experiment that you could carry out actually quite easily. So you could, you could compare between participants. So some people would have an experience to have that, and other people wouldn't. You could track some of those differences, and I wonder, things like the hippocampus and everything, whether that might have an impact on that. And just being able to see space. I know when I first got my Oculus Quest headset, putting it on when you're in your living room, quite a small room, you put it on, and you just suddenly you feel like you're in this huge expanse, and it's really exciting. So I think that will be something that will definitely happen if they can afford the weight. Obviously going to Mars will be, it's all about weight. But so next time we talk about Mars, we need to talk about the physics of it, which will be very interesting. I mean, one of the things we didn't mention was the fact that as you get closer to Mars, you've got a 20-minute delay each way to communication, which is another psychological problem in that you're not able to talk to your friends, your relatives, or anybody in real time, so you end up with this huge delay.
Because also, if it's one thing not talking to your friends without the 40-minute delay, but if something goes wrong, you don't have immediate feedback. You now have to troubleshoot on the fly, waiting for a potentially out-of-date response by the time it gets to you.
Which in itself is changing a little bit the way that they would want to select the crew, I would say. So if you've got near Earth orbits and so on, then you really want a crew who's going to do what they're told. You want a crew who's going to obey orders. Whereas when you're talking about Mars, you want a crew who, yes, I suppose they do want to follow procedures, but they also need to think on their feet. So you need to have an increased amount of autonomy to make decisions and do whatever you need to do at the time. So that's a bit different. It's a slightly different skill set, I would suggest.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, I reckon we're done for now. So yeah, as a listener, if you're interested in this topic, then by all means, throw some comments our way. A good way to do that is through the Facebook group, the Matter Over Mind Facebook group, currently still open. We don't have any bad behaved people in there, so it's they're all lovely. So join us on that to ask questions or make comments. And also in there, you can also tell us what you want us to talk about. What topics do you want us to look at? So we are still early in season 2, so we've got options to do different things, talk about different things. So please do that. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel if you're watching on YouTube. Now with video, as you can see, so subscribe to that and like if you can. And if you are able to give us a review on Apple Podcasts, that's great. Tell people about it. It's the hardest thing in the world, podcasting. I think I looked up, it was about 1 million podcasts. We blew past 1 million a couple of years ago. So there are literally hundreds of thousands, possibly millions now, of podcasts out there. Trying to get your little head above the parapet is very, very difficult. So, help. Cool. Are we done?
Cool. Yeah, thank you very much. Bye, folks.
All right, thank you. See you soon. Bye for now.